On Yom Tov, we have a desire to fulfill the mitzvah of Oneg Yom Tov. Good. On the other hand, and this is going back to Talmudic times, communities adapted stringencies on Pesach that throughout the year would not apply. So for example, throughout the year, if you have a concern that perhaps there's a product in the marketplace that where it is processed, they might use a little bit of something non-kosher. We're not very concerned because that little bit is nullified. It is batel. Okay, so for example, when in the 16th century, in the marketplace in Krakow, there was a young rabbi that was concerned because he heard that some of the olive oil that comes from Italy is transported in barrels that is smeared with some kind of pig fat. And therefore, he believed that there's an issue with the olive oil in Krakow. So they come to Rav Moshe Isserles, the great rabbi of Krakow, and he writes, worry not, because it doesn't give a pleasant flavor into the olive oil, and it is batel. It's a key word here. It's nullified, and we're very, very familiar with the term batel b'shishim. However, Pesach is different, because when it comes to Pesach, these rules of nullification do not always apply. So there are stringencies, and as a result of these stringencies, there's a list of foods that if I go through the authorities of the 15th and the 16th century, they tell me those we don't use on Pesach. One example had to do with honey. Honey. There was a big to-do about honey. Honey was popular because people would use it for an alcoholic beverage known as the mead, med in Yiddish. And if you need honey to produce it, and the honey is not local, there was a concern that it was perhaps transported in vessels that had chametz. So there was a discussion about honey. In what cases is it acceptable, in one case is not. The general approach was that if there's a honeycomb in it, so you could tell that it's in its original container. So there's a discussion about honey, not one we're going to focus on a lot now. Then there's a discussion about dried fruit, a lot of literature about dried fruit. And there were communities in the 16th, 17th, and believe it or not, into the 20th century that had the minhag of avoiding all dried fruit on Pesach. Why? Because in the 16th century, the apricots, for example, came from Turkey into Europe. They came dried. They were dried because they were placed on these tables, and they would be placed in the sun or ovens, and after they would lose their moisture due to the process of drying, they would be transported into Northern Europe. Often, to avoid the dried apricot from sticking to the surface it was drying on, they would sprinkle a little bit of flour. Or perhaps they were not doing it with flour, but the rabbis were not sure, and therefore there was a minhag to avoid dried fruit, which included, by the way, raisins. So there's a lot of literature about raisins. In the past, we've discussed in detail that one of the items that the rabbis believed is for sure chametz, and most probably it was the case, was granulated sugar. Why was sugar an issue? So two concerns existed. At one point, the concern was that when the sugar would arrive in the ports, either in Hamburg or Amsterdam or in other locations, from their countries that were obviously in the southern region, when the sugar would arrive, the sugar was expensive, flour was cheap. So what would the merchants do? They would add some flour into the granulated sugar, and that is what you would buy in the marketplace. So it was basically chametz. Sugar was a major issue and a major to-do for another reason, and that is when sugar started coming in from the New World, what would take place is that they would ship in these barrels from Europe to the New World grain, or flour in some cases, and they would ship back sugar in the exact same barrel. So sugar was a very sensitive issue. However, there was one sugar that the rabbis were lenient, not completely, but they were lenient that on day 8 it would be considered acceptable. And that it was called sugar kandil or others called it sugar candia. What exactly is sugar candia? So you are familiar with the Greek island of Crete. And the island of Crete, during the period of time that it was controlled by the Venetian Empire or the Venetian conquest, from the beginning of the 13th century until I think the 17th century, it was actually known as the Kingdom of Candia. That was the name. And in halachic literature, they talk about sugar that comes from Candia, right? Kuf Nun Daled Yud Aleph, or Kingdom of Candia, Candia. Now, I looked up a little bit, and actually it's mentioned that a significant area of sugar production during the 15th century was in the Kingdom of Candia. When I was studying this with my son Moshe, he wondered if perhaps the word candy originates from the idea that sugar originated from Candia. Maybe yes, maybe no. We could do our own research on that. But now, there was a rabbi, I think his name was Reb Zanvil was his name, Reb Zanvil. And we are told that Reb Zanvil, in the beginning of the 15th century, it appears he was on a trip to Candia. And this is the language that appears in the Maharil, a great early Ashkenazi authority. And he writes that this Zanvil hetir letalmidav, he gave permission to his students, le'echol, to eat, biyom tov ha'achron, on the last day of Pesach, only the last day, only on day 8. On day 8, in many communities, there are leniencies that would not be allowed on the other 7 days due to the fact that day 8 is only rabbinic. For those of you who come from Hasidic backgrounds, you obviously know that the knedels and the gebroks is acceptable on day 8. So this Reb Zanvil, allowed on day 8 to eat the tzukar shehevi imo mekandia. He himself traveled from Candia, and he ate the sugar, but this was not granulated sugar. It was sugar on either a string or a stick. They call it rock sugar or something like that. That was a significant issue in halacha. Now, all these foods mentioned up until this point, and by the way, the list is longer. Some people did not eat garlic. Some did not eat cloves. Different practices. They all came about and turned into minagim due to a concern. Now, there is something unique about Kitnyot, because Kitnyot, everyone knows there's no longer a concern, right? There's no issue at all. Kitnyot are not chametz. My garbanzo beans or my lentils or my rice, they're not chametz. And nevertheless, we still are continuing with this tradition. When it comes to sugar, we all use, unfortunately, by the way, a lot of sugar on Pesach, right? So even though if we would go ahead and contact the Ramah and give him a call, right, 500 years ago, and mention to him that every good Yiddish home is eating sugar, he would faint. But obviously, we would explain to him that the times, they are a-changing, and therefore it's okay. Suddenly, when it comes to Kitnyot, we are sticking to the old practices. So what we're going to do is we're going to go briefly, we're going to go ahead and review a little bit about the history of Kitnyot. And this is something we've studied in the past, that Kitnyot find their roots, the roots that note that there's an issue of eating legumes, beans, lentils, right? And garbanzos. I mention garbanzos often because I enjoy hummus, right? So the source for these prohibitions make their appearance in the 13th century. And for us Jews, by the way, the 13th century is late, is very late. It's recent. It's like yesterday. It's not in the Talmud, remember? So therefore, it is a later custom. And if you look at the sources I quoted, it mentions there the commentary of Rabbeinu Peretz. He's the first, again, a 13th century authority. And he talks about specific beans that existed in northern France, puish, puli, rish, and adashim, which relates to some kind of legumes, most probably rice and lentils. So he writes in line 2 that many people have a custom of not eating them on Pesach, a clear indication that great rabbis already were avoiding it on Pesach. However, Mori Rabbeinu Yechiel, the great Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, he was in the middle of the 13th century, the greatest Rosh Hashiva in Paris. Eventually has made his way to the land of Israel, according to many, to Akko of all places. But we are told that Rabbeinu Yechiel would eat his white poish, his white beans there, pula lavan, a specific type of legume. Now, we see already a machloket, and Rabbeinu Peretz himself tells us, you should know that my opinion is we should continue with the practice of avoiding it. And he tells us, you want to know why? So he tells us that it is really a concern due to the fact that there is great similarity if you compare the processing of legumes to the processing of grain. There are similarities. Both of them, they make flour out of them. Both seem to be in the field process in a similar way. And therefore, he notes, and in the last line, if you look at the first paragraph or the second one, and he says, Kevan de aidi v'aidi masektera, since both of them are cooked in a pot like grain, they're processed, they're eaten like a grain. So therefore, the similarity for me is good enough of a reason to say they are prohibited. Okay? So that is if we would visit the great rabbis of the 13th century, some say there is an issue, some say not. Let's move forward into the 14th century, and we're going to turn to the next, I didn't put numbers, but it's the Tur, Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim. He is the first one that divides Shulchan Aruch into the sections that we are familiar with, Orach Chaim, Yored Deah. And he tells us that you should know, there are those who prohibit orez, rice, and there are those who prohibit kitniot, because there's a concern that perhaps some grain is mixed into it. I actually once in Buffalo, going back 20 years ago, I talked about kitniot. And I mentioned the concern, according to Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim, that perhaps it is an issue with storage, that people would store grain together with legumes, and therefore the prohibition came into existence. So there was an archaeologist there that told me that they found in digs in the Middle East that actually people would store the two together. So for me, I think I have a little bit perhaps of an historical explanation to Kitnyot, how it originated. It originated that due to the fact that people would store their grain with beans, so before Pesach, the Yiddish mama would do what? Would sit there and remove grain from beans. And the young child would ask, Mama, what are you doing? And she would say, before Pesach, you have to be careful with your beans to remove the grain, because if you're going to be cooking your beans, if you're going to be cooking your rice and your legumes, and there's some grain in it, and you cook it on Pesach, it's chametz. So the child remembered the mama telling him and the baba telling him that you're supposed to be careful with your legumes. The next thing we know, there was a pogrom. They were exiled to a different region. The child perhaps did not see his parents, but he did remember hearing from the parent that you have to be careful with your legumes. Bingo, perhaps that's how the minhag started. That's an explanation that's very, very possible, because we are dealing here with a practice, and only afterwards explanations come into existence. It's unique. It's not that rabbis got together and said, we're going to prohibit it. No, it was a minhag. We're not sure why. We're very traditional. We continue with it. And then later on, rabbis came up with explanations. Now, it's interesting to note that there was a great rabbi in Provence in the late 13th century. His name was Rabbeinu Manoach. Rabbeinu Manoach. And he also notes that many communities avoided legumes on Pesach, not all. So he gives of the following explanation. He was of the opinion that really legumes are 100% acceptable. They're not chametz, it's not a grain. Of course you could cook your legumes with water. It's not one of the 5 types of grain. But nevertheless, he notes that it is possible that since we are told, and we'll read it inside, Rabbeinu Manoach, so it's the 3rd section I quote. And he says, Velo mistaber lomar, it's not logical. Sheyeh haminhag talui beisur klal. It is not logical that this minhag is because of a prohibition. It makes no sense. Because she'ein b'shum kitniot ba'olam shum chimutz. It's not chametz. Kitniot are not chametz. So therefore, he gives us, this great Rabbeinu Manoach, a different explanation. And that is, Ela mipnei she'en derech le'echol kitniot b'moed. In other words, beans are considered cheap food. They're not considered food that enhance your Yom Tov. And he adds, Katuv b'Torah b'samachta b'chagecha, you're supposed to be happy. Ve'en simcha, and there's no happiness if you eat kitniot. So his approach is, you know why they avoided kitniot on Pesach? It's not Yom Tov dik, it's not a good food. Perhaps it's interesting, if so, we shouldn't be eating on Sukkot or Shavuot, but it shares with us this idea that rabbis struggled with it. But nevertheless, it became codified. And it's mentioned by Shulchan Aruch for us Ashkenazim, for the followers of the Ramah. And we are ones who are sticking to it. We still take Kitniot into consideration. I have here the quote from Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who believed that it would be magnificent if we could go ahead and nullify it, right? And he notes even more. This was an interesting tshuva, which is going to relate to our second discussion about Kitniot. What happens if you discover a new food that the rabbis of the 13th century, who tell us that we are supposed to avoid Kitniot, were not familiar with, right? What happens if, for example, in Europe, they start using something called kartoffel, potatoes? What happens if they start using corn, which the rabbis of the 13th century did not mention? Or in the 20th century, what happens if we suddenly realize that we could enjoy Pesach with some good quinoa? What's the status of such things? So when it comes to those new ingredients, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and this is Emden, a 17th, late 17th, I should say, early 18th century authority, passed away in 1856, if I'm not mistaken, or 1763, I'm sorry. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden tells us, number one, that his great father, the Chacham Tzvi, was against the practice, but nevertheless, if Jews are doing it, you can't nullify it, which tells us, by the way, that even the rabbis that were not so happy with the practice, they weren't recommending nullifying it. But he does share with us that one time he was visiting the city of Mannheim. He was visiting the city of Mannheim, and the rabbi there decided that he's gonna declare that kartoffel or erdapfel, which are potatoes, are kitniot. Why? The rabbi there believed that since some of the authorities tell us that kitniot are prohibited because they are processed in a similar way to grain, and since from potatoes you can make potato flour, so therefore the rabbi in Mannheim wanted to prohibit kitniot on Pesach. But Rav Yaakov Emden said, no, nitzachti otam. I argued with the rabbi and I won the debate, because you want to prohibit a davar chadash. Why prohibit that which the earlier rabbis did not? And this approach of Rav Yaakov Emden, that they look at Kitniot in the following way. Yes, we have to follow the tradition regarding those things that the great rabbis, and they were great rabbis of the 13th century, prohibited for whatever reason. So therefore, if the great rabbis prohibited rice and prohibited legumes and prohibited garbanzo beans, we have to follow. But we're not going to take the reasons to prohibit new things. Nothing new should be prohibited. Nothing new should be prohibited. That's what Rav Yaakov Emden says. And if you look, I actually presented a tshuva here from Rav Moshe Feinstein that follows that same way of thinking. Yes, there are specific things that we have a tradition that date back to the 13th century, but don't add to it. So therefore, Rav Moshe Feinstein believed that peanuts should be 100% acceptable for Pesach. Now, he does say that if there's a minhag in a specific place, you're stuck with the minhag. And it appears, by the way, that in the city of Toronto, the minhag is that we don't eat peanuts. But Rav Moshe Feinstein believed peanuts should not be an issue. Why? The species are the ones that create the issue, not the reasoning. In other words, only that was mentioned by the great rabbis of the 13th century is going to be considered kitniot. Nothing else, okay? And therefore, that's the reason there's no issue with quinoa. That's why you should enjoy your quinoa, because you could follow the great rabbis. And obviously not all rabbis agree. Obviously, if you ask some rabbis, even in this wonderful town, some great Torah scholars, they'll tell you that there's an issue with Kitnyot, and we have to respect everyone. But reality is that if you live in North America, you could 100% follow what Ramosha Feinstein says. Perhaps with peanuts, we have to respect the minhag, but there's no historical minhag Toronto that go back to Rabbi Grobart, right, of not eating quinoa, because it only showed up some 25 years ago, perhaps. Now, if you think about it, why did they prohibit kitniot? It's similar to grain. Now, if I take legumes and extract from it some oil, that oil should be fine. Why? Because the whole concern is that you might mix up a legume with grain. And if I take grain and add water to it, it becomes chametz. But if you extract some liquid, some oil out of a legume, there should really not be an issue. However, historically, and this is in the 16th, 17th, 18th, into the 19th century, oils were always extracted by soaking the beans or the sesames or whatever you are using to get your oil in water. And you have here a bean in water. So there the decree does apply. Because if you would take grain and soak it in water, it's chametz. So therefore the decree would apply even to in oil, due to the fact that oil was always a production that was done with water. That changed in the late 19th century when dry extraction began, when they developed the technology to extract oils from sesame and from a rapeseed, right? From the canola oil, eventually it turned into here in Canada. That was a new development of the late 19th century. And two great rabbis, the two poskim in Europe at that time, actually gave a green light for oils. One of them was Rav Shvadron in Galicia, and the other one was Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector in Kovna. Both of them gave a green light to oils. But it appears that many communities did not follow it. What we discussed once in great detail, the major tumult that occurred in 1909, where there was a young, great rabbi in the city of Yafo, Tel Aviv Yafo, but Tel Aviv was really new then, 1909. And the name of this great rabbi was Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook. And the brothers Breslov had a production of sesame oil. And what they did was that they roasted the sesame and they extracted the oil without any liquid. And therefore, this was considered permissible according to the great poskim. So Rav Kook gave a hashgacha, gave his stamp of approval. But Rabbanim of the old yeshuv, the rabbis of the old yeshuv were against it and created a major tumult. I talked about this in the past, but it just gives you a little bit of the history. Now, I have shared with you in the past that I have a deep desire to bring back peanut oil for Pesach. Why do I have an emotional attachment to peanut oil on Pesach, which you can't really find today? So it goes back to a tshuva. There was a great rabbi in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, one of the greatest poskim of the early days of the state of Israel. And Rav Tzvi Pesach was asked a question from Montevideo, Uruguay, my grandfather. And the question was about peanut oil for Pesach. And basically, what Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, the great posek, tells Rabbi Malevsky from Montevideo, Uruguay, is that there are two good reasons to allow peanut oil. Reason number one, peanuts. Reason number two, oil. In other words, peanuts technically are not really kitniot. So true, there's a custom, but the reality is it's not mentioned by the great rabbinic authorities of the 13th century. Rabbeinu Peretz does not mention peanuts. Number two, we're talking about a dry production where you are extracting the oil without any water. So therefore, he gave a stamp of approval, and therefore it was the norm 30 years ago in the marketplace to find peanut oil for Pesach. But it seems to be that for whatever reason that is not being produced. It's a little bit shocking, to me at least, because peanut oil would be 100% acceptable. Many of the products that are bagged or placed in boxes that look exactly like the same product that has chametz, that is a far greater problem than some peanut oil. And it's a little bit surprising that the kosher agencies allow one and not the other, because that is a serious concern. To produce tam-tams that look so similar to chametz, and mistakes do occur, that is very shocking. And therefore, obviously, when we talk about food, and it's good to have Yom Tov food, it's Simchas Yom Tov, obviously you have to keep your eyes open product by product to be sure you get the right item from shelf into the cupboard and from cupboard onto the table. That's what we have to remember. This was only a little bit of a Kitnyot discussion and a reminder, and it's interesting how in Israel there's a little bit of level of leniency in some communities. We've talked about that in the past. We also about the idea that Kitnyot technically are batel. There's also a discussion that has occurred regarding Diet Coke in Toronto, which we have occurred at as well. But I'm going to open up. If anyone does have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask the question about specifically Kitnyot. Monday morning, we're going to talk about all kind of different things, including the Zoom Seder. I'm sure you've heard a discussion about a Seder through Zoom, a lot of discussion over the past few days, even in the media and among halachic authorities, and a few other things that came up. Go ahead, question.
Is cold compressed olive oil the same as what you're talking about, peanut oil?
Okay, so cold olive oil, everyone agrees, is not kitniot. So olive oil is 100% acceptable. Now, when it comes to olive oil, there are two types of production of olive oil. One of them is cold press, which is extracted cold, which is the EVOO, the extra virgin olive oil, which is fine, even though according to some, perhaps you can't trust the Italians, that maybe they mix in some other oils, but in general, the extra virgin olive oil is fine. Clearly, if it's regular olive oil, you have to be sure it has hashgacha due to the concern of equipment. Okay?
Thank you.
I don't understand by what authority contemporary rabbis can take a psak that says things that aren't known are not subject to kitnios and just willy-nilly override that psak.
How do they override the psak? So obviously, I am being biased and sharing one school. In other words, I took the school of Rav Yaakov Emdin, of Rav Moshe Feinstein, and other poskim, but there's another school. And in some Hasidic communities, they viewed it very differently. They didn't view it the way I presented it, is that there was a practice and then we came up with explanations. They view it, and obviously it's far less historical, and I could say not as correct, but I have to respect them, that rabbis perhaps did get together and they realized that there could be confusion, and therefore they made a decree on specific items. If that would be the case, it's not, but if that would be the case, so then the reasons would dictate that even those things that did not exist during that period of time, like the potatoes and like the peanuts and like the quinoa, would be included. Now, by the way, technically speaking, corn should be fine, but corn has a very bad name. You know how they called corn in Europe, right? Turkish weitz, like Turkish wheat. You call something wheat, you're going to lose out. You're not going to have it chametz. If they would have just called it something else, right? They would have just called it Kellogg's, for example, as it showed up in the marketplace. We would have been eating our corn on Pesach. But was kenechtan, that's what occurred. Bad mazel with the name Shmo Garim, as they say in our tradition. Okay.
Correct, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Very good. Listen, this was
amazing.
good. A short little, this was more of to keep the Limud Torah a little bit of live, but our goal is Monday morning. If you do have specific questions, you can email me, because Monday we're going to be covering everything that we could at least. It will be an extended shir, maybe an hour. So if you do have specific questions, we could bring them up. Tonight was a little bit of a Limud Torah, and hopefully we gained a little bit of knowledge. I do thank you all for participating in this mini shir. And let's continue our good things in our learning. And I could wish everyone a good evening. Good evening and a good night.
Take it
And the
to
good
mass.
Shabbos.
And a good Shabbos as well.
Thank you.
Please take care of yourselves and only good things. Okay.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Have a good